This is Chapter 71 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 71. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we were winding down a mountain of dreary and desolate lava to the sea, and closing our pleasant land journey. This lava is the accumulation of ages. One torrent of fire after another has rolled down here in old times and built up the island structure higher and higher. Underneath, it is honeycombed with caves. It would be of no use to dig wells in such a place. They would not hold water. You would not find any for them to hold, for that matter. Consequently, the planters depend upon cisterns. The last lava flow occurred here so long ago that there are none now living who witnessed it. In one place it enclosed and burned down a grove of cocoanut trees, and the holes in the lava where the trunks stood are still visible. Their sides retain the impression of the bark. The trees fell upon the burning river, and becoming partly submerged, left in it the perfect counterpart of every knot and branch and leaf, and even nut, for curiosity-seekers of a long-distant day to gaze upon and wonder at. There were doubtless plenty of Kanaka sentinels on guard hereabouts at that time, but they did not leave casts of their figures in the lava as the Roman sentinels at Herculaneum and Pompeii did. It is a pity it is so, because such things are so interesting, and so it is. They probably went away. They went away early, perhaps. However, they had their merits. The Romans exhibited the higher pluck, but the Kanakas showed the sounder judgment. Shortly we came in sight of that spot whose history is so familiar to every schoolboy in the wide world. Kealakekua Bay, the place where Captain Cook, the great circumnavigator, was killed by the natives nearly 100 years ago. The setting sun was flaming upon it, a summer shower was falling, and it was spanned by two magnificent rainbows. Two men who were in advance of us rode through one of these, and for a moment their garments shone with a more than regal splendor. Why did not Captain Cook have taste enough to call his great discovery the Rainbow Islands? These charming spectacles are present to you at every turn. They are common in all the islands. They are visible every day, and frequently at night also. Not the silvery bow we see once in an age in the States, by moonlight, but barred with all bright and beautiful colors, like the children of the sun and rain. I saw one of them a few nights ago. What the sailors call rain-dogs, little patches of rainbow, are often seen drifting about the heavens in these latitudes, like stained cathedral windows. Kealakekua Bay is a little curve like the last kink of a snail-shell, winding deep into the land, seemingly not more than a mile wide from shore to shore. It is bounded on one side, where the murder was done, by a little flat plain, on which stands a cocoanut grove and some ruined houses. A steep wall of lava, 1,000 feet high at the upper end and 300 or 400 at the lower, comes down from the mountain and bounds the inner extremity of it. From this wall the place takes its name, Kealakekua, which in the native tongue signifies the pathways of the gods. They say, and still believe in spite of their liberal education in Christianity, that the great god Lono, who used to live upon the hillside, always traveled that causeway when urgent business connected with heavenly affairs called him down to the seashore in a hurry. As the red sun looked across the placid ocean through the tall, clean stems of the cocoanut trees, like a blooming whiskey bloat through the bars of a city prison, I went and stood in the edge of the water on the flat rock pressed by Captain Cook's feet when the blow was dealt which took away his life, and tried to picture in my mind the doomed man struggling in the midst of the multitude of exasperated savages, the men in the ship crowding to the vessel's side and gazing in anxious dismay toward the shore, but I discovered that I could not do it. It was growing dark. The rain began to fall. We could see that the distant Boomerang was helplessly becalmed at sea, and so I adjourned to the cheerless little box of a warehouse and sat down to smoke and think and wished the ship would make the land, for we had not eaten much for 10 hours, and were viciously hungry. Plain, unvarnished history takes the romance out of Captain Cook's assassination, and renders a deliberate verdict of justifiable homicide. Wherever he went among the islands, he was cordially received and welcomed by the inhabitants, and his ships lavishly supplied with all manner of food. He returned these kindnesses with insult and ill treatment. Perceiving that the people took him for the long-vanished and lamented god Lono, he encouraged them in the delusion for the sake of the limitless power it gave him. But during the famous disturbance at this spot, and while he and his comrades were surrounded by 15,000 maddened savages, he received a hurt and betrayed his earthly origin with a groan. It was his death warrant. Instantly a shout went up, "He groans! He is not a god!" So they closed in upon him and dispatched him. His flesh was stripped from the bones and burned, except 9 pounds of it, which were sent on board the ships. The heart was hung up in a native hut, where it was found and eaten by 3 children, who mistook it for the heart of a dog. One of these children grew to be a very old man, and died in Honolulu a few years ago. Some of Cook's bones were recovered and consigned to the deep by the officers of the ships. Small blame should attach to the natives for the killing of Cook. They treated him well. In return, he abused them. He and his men inflicted bodily injury upon many of them at different times, and killed at least 3 of them before they offered any proportionate retaliation. Near the shore we found Cook's monument, only a coconut stump, 4 feet high and about a foot in diameter at the butt. It had lava boulders piled around its base to hold it up and keep it in its place, and it was entirely sheathed over, from top to bottom, with rough, discolored sheets of copper, such as ships' bottoms are coppered with. Each sheet had a rude inscription scratched upon it, with a nail apparently, and in every case the execution was wretched. Most of these merely recorded the visits of British naval commanders to the spot, but one of them bore this legend: "Near this spot fell Captain James Cook, the distinguished navigator, who discovered these islands A.D. 1778. After Cook's murder, his second-in-command on board the ship opened fire upon the swarms of natives on the beach, and one of his cannon-balls cut this coconut tree short off, and left this monumental stump standing. It looked sad and lonely enough to us, out there in the rainy twilight. But there is no other monument to Captain Cook. True, up on the mountainside we had passed by a large enclosure like an ample hog-pen built of lava blocks, which marks the spot where Cook's flesh was stripped from his bones and burned. But this is not properly a monument, since it was erected by the natives themselves, and less to do honor to the circumnavigator than for the sake of convenience in roasting him. A thing like the guide-board was elevated above this pen on a tall pole, and formerly there was an inscription upon it, describing the memorable occurrence that had there taken place. But the sun and the wind have long ago so defaced it as to render it illegible. Toward midnight a fine breeze sprang up, and the schooner soon worked herself into the bay and cast anchor. The boat came ashore for us, and in a little while the clouds and the rain were all gone. The moon was beaming tranquilly down on land and sea, and we two were stretched upon the deck, sleeping the refreshing sleep and dreaming the happy dreams that are only vouchsafed to the weary and the innocent. End of chapter 71. This is chapter 72 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 72. In the breezy morning we went ashore and visited the ruined temple of the last god Lono. The high chief cook of this temple, the priest who presided over it and roasted the human sacrifices, was uncle to Obukia, and at one time that youth was an apprentice priest under him. Obukia was a young native of fine mind, who, together with 3 other native boys, was taken to New England by the captain of a whale ship during the reign of Kamehameha I, and they were the means of attracting the attention of the religious world to their country. This resulted in the sending of missionaries there, and this Obukia was the very same sensitive savage who sat down on the church steps and wept because his people did not have the Bible. That incident has been very elaborately painted in many a charming Sunday school book, and told so plaintively and so tenderly that I have cried over it in Sunday school myself, on general principles, although at a time when I did not know much and could not understand why the people of the Sandwich Islands needed to worry so much about it as long as they did not know there was a Bible at all. Obukia was converted and educated, and was to have returned to his native land with the first missionaries had he lived. The other native youths made the voyage, and 2 of them did good service, but the third, William Kanui, fell from grace afterward, for a time, and when the gold excitement broke out in California he journeyed thither and went to mining, although he was 50 years old. He succeeded pretty well, but the failure of Page, Bacon and Company relieved him of $6,000, and then, to all intents and purposes, he was a bankrupt in his old age, and he resumed service in the pulpit again. He died in Honolulu in 1864. Quite a broad tract of land near the temple, extending from the sea to the mountain top, was sacred to the god Lono in olden times, so sacred that if a common native set his sacrilegious foot upon it, it was judicious for him to make his will, because his time had come. He might go around it by water, but he could not cross it. It was well sprinkled with pagan temples and stocked with awkward, homely idols carved out of logs of wood. There was a temple devoted to prayers for rain, and with fine sagacity it was placed at a point so well up on the mountainside that if you prayed there 24 times a day for rain, you would be likely to get it every time. You would seldom get to your Amen before you would have to hoist your umbrella. And there was a large temple near at hand which was built in a single night, in the midst of storm and thunder and rain, by the ghastly hands of dead men. Tradition says that by the weird glare of the lightning a noiseless multitude of phantoms were seen at their strange labor far up the mountainside at dead of night, flitting hither and thither and bearing great lava blocks clasped in their nerveless fingers, appearing and disappearing as the pallid luster fell upon their forms and faded away again. Even to this day, it is said, the natives hold this dread structure in awe and reverence, and will not pass by it in the night. At noon I observed a bevy of nude native young ladies bathing in the sea, and went and sat down on their clothes to keep them from being stolen. I begged them to come out, for the sea was rising, and I was satisfied that they were running some risk. But they were not afraid, and presently went on with their sport. They were finished swimmers and divers, and enjoyed themselves to the last degree. They swam races, splashed and ducked and tumbled each other about, and filled the air with their laughter. It is said that the first thing an islander learns is how to swim. Learning to walk, being a matter of smaller consequence, comes afterward. One hears tales of native men and women swimming ashore from vessels many miles at sea, more miles, indeed, than I dare vouch for or even mention. And they tell of a native diver who went down in 30 or 40-foot waters and brought up an anvil. I think he swallowed the anvil afterwards, if my memory serves me. However, I will not urge this point. I have spoken, several times, of the god Lono. I may as well furnish 2 or 3 sentences concerning him. The idol the natives worshipped for him was a slender, unornamented staff 12 feet long. Tradition says he was a favorite god on the island of Hawaii, a great king who had been deified for meritorious services, just our own fashion of rewarding heroes, with the difference that we would have made him a postmaster instead of a god, no doubt. In an angry moment he slew his wife, a goddess named Kaikilani-ai. Remorse of conscience drove him mad, and tradition presents us the singular spectacle of a god traveling on the shoulder, for in his gnawing grief he wandered about from place to place, boxing and wrestling with all whom he met. Of course this pastime soon lost its novelty, inasmuch as it must necessarily have been the case that when so powerful a deity sent a frail human opponent to grass, he never came back any more. Therefore he instituted games called makahiki, and ordered that they should be held in his honor, and then sailed for foreign lands on a three-cornered raft, stating that he would return some day, and that was the last of Lono. He was never seen any more. His raft got swamped, perhaps, but the people always expected his return, and thus they were easily led to accept Captain Cook as the restored god. Some of the old natives believed Cook was Lono to the day of their death, but many did not, for they could not understand how he could die if he was a god. Only a mile or so from Kealakekua Bay is a spot of historic interest, the place where the last battle was fought for idolatry. Of course we visited it, and came away as wise as most people do who go and gaze upon such mementos of the past when in an unreflective mood. While the first missionaries were on their way around the Horn, the idolatrous customs which had obtained in the island as far back as tradition reached were suddenly broken up. Old Kamehameha I was dead, and his son Liholiho, the new king, was a free liver, a roistering, dissolute fellow, and hated the restraints of the ancient taboo. His assistant in the government, Kahumanu, the queen dowager, was proud and high-spirited, and hated the taboo because it restricted the privileges of her sex and degraded all women very nearly to the level of brutes. So the case stood. Liholiho had half a mind to put his foot down. Kahumanu had a whole mind to badger him into doing it, and whiskey did the rest. It was probably the rest. It was probably the first time whiskey ever prominently figured as an aid to civilization. Liholiho came up to Kailua as drunk as a piper, and attended a great feast. The determined queen spurred his drunken courage up to a reckless pitch, and then, while all the multitude stared in blank dismay, he moved deliberately forward and sat down with the women. They saw him eat from the same vessel with them, and were appalled. Terrible moments drifted slowly by, and still the king ate, still he lived, still the lightnings of the insulted gods were withheld. Then conviction came like a revelation. The superstitions of 100 generations passed from before the people like a cloud, and a shout went up, "The taboo is broken! The taboo is broken!" Thus did King Liholiho and his dreadful whiskey preach the first sermon and prepare the way for the new gospel that was speeding southward over the waves of the Atlantic. The taboo broken, and destruction failing to follow the awful sacrilege, the people, with that childlike precipitancy which has always characterized them, jumped to the conclusion that their gods were a weak and wretched swindle, just as they formerly jumped to the conclusion that Captain Cook was no god merely because he groaned, and promptly killed him without stopping to inquire whether a god might not groan as well as a man if it suited his convenience to do it. And satisfied that the idols were powerless to protect themselves, they went to work at once and pulled them down, hacked them to pieces, applied the torch, annihilated them. The pagan priests were furious, and well they might be. They had held the fattest offices in the land, and now they were beggared. They had been great, they had stood above the chiefs, and now they were vagabonds. They raised a revolt, they scared a number of people into joining their standard, and Bekuakalani, an ambitious offshoot of royalty, was easily persuaded to become their leader. In the first skirmish the idolaters triumphed over the royal army sent against them, and full of confidence they resolved to march upon Kailua. The king sent an envoy to try and conciliate them, and came very near being an envoy short by the operation. The savages not only refused to listen to him, but wanted to kill him. So the king sent his men forth under Major General Kalaimoku, and the two hosts met at Kuamu. The battle was long and fierce, men and women fighting side by side, as was the custom, and when the day was done the rebels were flying in every direction in hopeless panic, and idolatry and the taboo were dead in the land. The royalists marched gaily home to Kailua, glorifying the new dispensation. "There is no power in the gods," said they. "They are a vanity and a lie. The army with idols was weak. The army without idols was strong and victorious." The nation was without a religion. The missionary ship arrived in safety shortly afterward, timed by providential exactness to meet the emergency, and the gospel was planted as in virgin soil. End of chapter 72. This is chapter 73 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, chapter 73. At noon we hired a Kanaka to take us down to the ancient ruins at Honuanan in his canoe, price $2, reasonable enough for a sea voyage of 8 miles, counting both ways. The native canoe is an irresponsible-looking contrivance. I cannot think of anything to liken it to but a boy's sled-runner hollowed out, and that does not quite convey the correct idea. It is about 15 feet long, high and pointed at both ends, is 1.5 feet or 2 feet deep, and is so narrow that if you wedged a fat man into it, you might not get him out again. It sits on top of the water like a duck, but it has an outrigger and does not upset easily, if you keep still. This outrigger is formed of 2 long bent sticks like plow handles, which project from one side, and to their outer ends is bound a curved beam composed of an extremely light wood, which skims along the surface of the water, and thus saves you from an upset on that side, while the outrigger's weight is not so easily lifted as to make an upset on the other side a thing to be greatly feared. Still, until one gets used to sitting perched upon this knife-blade, he is apt to reason within himself that it would be more comfortable if there were just an outrigger or so on the other side also. I had the bow seat, and Billings sat amidships and faced the Kanaka, who occupied the stern of the craft and did the paddling. With the first stroke, the trim shell of a thing shot out from the shore like an arrow. There was not much to see. While we were on the shallow water of the reef, it was past time to look down into the limpid depths at the large bunches of branching coral, the unique shrubbery of the sea. We lost that, though, when we got out into the dead blue water of the deep. But we had the picture of the surf, then, dashing angrily against the crag-bound shore and sending a foaming spray high into the air. There was interest in this beetling border, too, for it was honeycombed with quaint caves and arches and tunnels, and had a rude semblance of the dilapidated architecture of ruined keeps and castles rising out of the restless sea. When this novelty ceased to be a novelty, we turned our eyes shoreward and gazed at the long mountain, with its rich green forest stretching up into the curtaining clouds, and at the specks of houses in the rearward distance, and the diminished schooner riding sleepily at anchor. And when these grew tiresome, we dashed boldly into the midst of a school of huge beastly porpoises engaged at their eternal game of arching over a wave and disappearing, and then doing it over again and keeping it up, always circling over in that way like so many well-submerged wheels. But the porpoises wheeled themselves away, and then we were thrown upon our own resources. It did not take many minutes to discover that the sun was blazing like a bonfire, and that the weather was of a melting temperature. It had a drowsing effect, too. In one place we came upon a large company of naked natives, of both sexes and all ages, amusing themselves with the national pastime of surf-bathing. Each heathen would paddle 300 or 400 yards out to sea, taking a short board with him, then face the shore and wait for a particularly prodigious billow to come along. At the right moment he would fling his board upon its foamy crest, and himself upon the board, and here he would come whizzing by like a bombshell. It did not seem that a lightning express train could shoot along at a more hair-lifting speed. I tried surf-bathing once, subsequently, but made a failure of it. I got the board placed right, and at the right moment, too, but missed the connection myself. The board struck the shore in 3/4 of a second, without any cargo, and I struck the bottom about the same time, with a couple of barrels of water in me. None but natives ever master the art of surf-bathing thoroughly. At the end of an hour we had made the 4 miles, and landed on a level point of land upon which was a wide extent of old ruins, with many a tall cocoanut tree growing among them. Here was the ancient city of Refuge, a vast enclosure whose stone walls were 20 feet thick at the base and 15 feet high, an oblong square, 1,040 feet one way and a fraction under 700 the other. Within this enclosure, in early times, has been 3 rude temples, each 210 feet long by 100 wide and 13 high. In those days, if a man killed another anywhere on the island, the relatives were privileged to take the murderer's life, and then a chase for life and liberty began, the outlawed criminal flying through pathless forests and over mountain and plain, with his hopes fixed upon the protecting walls of the city of Refuge, and the avenger of blood following hotly after him. Sometimes the race was kept up to the very gates of the temple, and the panting pair sped through long files of excited natives who watched the contest with flashing eye and dilated nostril, encouraging the hunted refugee with sharp, inspiring ejaculations, and sending up a ringing shout of exultation when the saving gates closed upon him and the cheated pursuer sank exhausted at the threshold. But sometimes the flying criminal fell under the hand of the avenger at the very door, when one more brave stride, one more brief second of time, would have brought his feet upon the sacred ground and barred him against all harm. Where did these isolated pagans get this idea of a city of refuge, this ancient Oriental custom? The old sanctuary was sacred to all, even to rebels in arms and invading armies. Once within its walls, and confession made to the priest and absolution obtained, the wretch with a price upon his head could go forth without fear and without danger. He was taboo, and to harm him was death. The routed rebels in the lost battle for idolatry fled to this place to claim sanctuary, and many were thus saved. Close to the corner of the great enclosure is a round structure of stone, some 6 or 8 feet high, with a level top about 10 or 12 feet in diameter. This was the place of execution. A high palisade of coconut piles shut out the cruel scenes from the vulgar multitude. Here criminals were killed, the flesh stripped from the bones and burned, and the bones secreted in holes in the body of the structure. If the man had been guilty of a high crime, the entire corpse was burned. The walls of the temple are a study. The same food for speculation that is offered the visitor to the pyramids of Egypt he will find here, the mystery of how they were constructed by the people unacquainted with science and mechanics. The natives have no invention of their own for hoisting heavy weights. They had no beasts of burden, and they had never even shown any knowledge of the properties of the lever. Yet some of the lava blocks quarried out, brought over rough, broken ground, and built into this wall, 6 or 7 feet from the ground, are of prodigious size, and would weigh tons. How did they transport and how raise them? Both the inner and outer surfaces of the walls present a smooth front and are very creditable specimens of masonry. The blocks are of all manner of shapes and sizes, but yet are fitted together with the neatest exactness. The gradual narrowing of the wall from the base upward is accurately preserved. No cement was used, but the edifice is firm and compact and is capable of resisting storm and decay for centuries. Who built this temple, and how was it built, and when, are mysteries that may never be unraveled. Outside of these ancient walls lies a sort of coffin-shaped stone 11 feet 4 inches long and 3 feet square at the small end. It would weigh a few thousand pounds, which the high chief who held sway over this district many centuries ago brought thither on his shoulder one day to use as a lounge. This circumstance is established by the most reliable traditions. He used to lie down on it, in his indolent way, and keep an eye on his subjects at work for him, and see that there was no soldiering done. And no doubt there was not any done to speak of, because he was a man of that sort of build that incites to attention to business on the part of an employee. He was 14 or 15 feet high. When he stretched himself at full length on his lounge, his legs hung down over the end, and when he snored he woke the dead. These facts are all attested by irrefragable tradition. On the other side of the temple is a monstrous 7-ton rock, 11 feet long, 7 feet wide, and 3 feet thick. It is raised a foot or a foot and a half above the ground, and rests upon half a dozen little stony pedestals. The same old 14-footer brought it down from the mountain, merely for fun (he had his own notions about fun), and propped it up as we find it now, and as others may find it a century hence, for it would take a score of horses to budge it from its position. They say that 50 or 60 years ago the proud Queen Kahumanu used to fly to this rock for safety, whenever she had been making trouble with her fierce husband, and hide under it until his wrath was appeased. But these Kanakas will lie, and this statement is one of their ablest efforts, for Kahumanu was 6 feet high, and she was bulky. She was built like an ox, and she could no more have squeezed herself under that rock than she could have passed between the cylinders of a sugar-mill. What could she gain by it, even if she succeeded? To be chased and abused by a savage husband could not be otherwise than humiliating to her high spirit, yet it could never make her feel so flat as an hour's repose under that rock would. We walked a mile over a raised macadamized road of uniform width, a road paved with flat stones, and exhibiting in its every detail a considerable degree of engineering skill. Some say that that wise old pagan, Kamehameha I, planned and built it, but others say it was built so long before his time that the knowledge of who constructed it has passed out of the traditions. In either case, however, as the handiwork of an untaught and degraded race, it is a thing of pleasing interest. The stones are worn and smooth and pushed apart in places, so that the road has the exact appearance of those ancient paved highways leading out of Rome which one sees in pictures. The object of our tramp was to visit a great natural curiosity at the base of the foothills, a congealed cascade of lava. Some old forgotten volcanic eruption sent its broad river of fire down the mountainside here, and it poured down in a great torrent from an overhanging bluff some 50 feet high to the ground below. The flaming torrent cooled in the winds from the sea, and remains there today, all seamed and frothed and rippled in a petrified Niagara. It is very picturesque, and withal so natural that one might almost imagine it still flowed. A smaller stream trickled over the cliff and built up an isolated pyramid about 30 feet high, which has the semblance of a mass of large gnarled and knotted vines, and roots, and stems intricately twisted and woven together. We passed in behind the cascade and the pyramid, and found the bluff pierced by several cavernous tunnels, whose crooked courses we followed a long distance. 2 of these winding tunnels stand as proof of nature's mining abilities. Their floors are level, they are 7 feet wide, and their roofs are gently arched. Their height is not uniform, however. We pass through one 100 feet long, which leads through a spur of the hill and opens out well up in the sheer wall of a precipice whose foot rests in the waves of the sea. It is a commodious tunnel, except that there are occasional places in it where one must stoop to pass under. The roof is lava, of course, and is thickly studded with little lava-pointed icicles an inch long, which hardened as they dripped. They project as closely together as the iron teeth of a corn-sheller, and if one will stand up straight and walk any distance there, he can get his hair combed free of charge. End of chapter 73. This is chapter 74 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, chapter 74. We got back to the schooner in good time, and then sailed down to Kau, where we disembarked and took final leave of the vessel. Next day we bought horses and bent our way over the summer-clad mountain terraces toward the great volcano of Kilauea. We made nearly a 2 days' journey of it, but that was on account of laziness. Toward sunset on the second day we reached an elevation of some 4,000 feet above sea level, and as we picked our careful way through billowy wastes of lava long generations ago stricken dead and cold in the climax of its tossing fury, we began to come upon signs of the near presence of the volcano, signs in the nature of ragged fissures that discharged jets of sulphurous vapor into the air, hot from the molten ocean down in the bowels of the mountain. Shortly the crater came into view, I have seen Vesuvius since, but it was a mere toy, a child's volcano, a soup kettle, compared to this. Mount Vesuvius is a shapely cone 3,600 feet high, its crater an inverted cone only 300 feet deep, and not more than 1,000 feet in diameter, if as much as that. Its fires meager, modest, and docile. But here was a vast perpendicular walled cellar, 900 feet deep in some places, 1,300 in others, level, floored, and 10 miles in circumference. Here was a yawning pit upon whose floor the armies of Russia could camp, and have room to spare. Perched upon the edge of the crater, at the opposite end from where we stood, was a small lookout house, say 3 miles away. It assisted us, by comparison, to comprehend and appreciate the great depth of the basin. It looked like a tiny martin box, clinging at the eaves of a cathedral. After some time spent in resting and looking and ciphering, we hurried on to the hotel. By the path, it is half a mile from the volcano house to the lookout house. After a hearty supper, we waited until it was thoroughly dark, and then started to the crater. The first glance in that direction revealed a scene of wild beauty. There was a heavy fog over the crater, and it was splendidly illuminated by the glare from the fires below. The illumination was 2 miles wide and a mile high, perhaps, and if you ever, on a dark night and at a distance, beheld the light from 30 or 40 blocks of distant buildings, all on fire at once, reflected strongly against overhanging clouds, you can form a fair idea of what this looked like. A colossal column of cloud towered to a great height in the air immediately above the crater, and the outer swell of every one of its vast folds was dyed with a rich crimson luster, which was subdued to a pale rose tint in the depression between. It glowed like a muffled torch, and stretched upward to a dizzy height toward the zenith. I thought it just possible that its like had not been seen since the children of Israel wandered on their long march through the desert so many centuries ago over a path illuminated by the mysterious pillar of fire. And I was sure that I now had a vivid conception of what the majestic pillar of fire was like, which almost amounted to a revelation. Arrived at the little thatched lookout house, we rested our elbows on the railing in front, and looked abroad over the wide crater and down over the sheer precipice at the seething fires beneath us. The view was a startling improvement on my daylight experience. I turned to see the effect on the balance of the company, and found the reddest-faced set of men I almost ever saw. In the strong light every countenance glowed like red-hot iron. Every shoulder was suffused with crimson, and shaded rearward into dingy, shapeless obscurity. The place below looked like the infernal regions, and these men like half-cooled devils just come up on a furlough. I turned my eyes upon the volcano again. The cellar was tolerably well lighted up. For a mile and a half in front of us, and half a mile on either side, the floor of the abyss was magnificently illuminated. Beyond these limits the mists hung down their gauzy curtains, and cast a deceptive gloom over all that made the twinkling fires in the remote corners of the crater seem countless leagues removed, made them seem like the campfires of a great army far away. Here was room for the imagination to work. You could imagine those lights the width of a continent away, and that hidden under the intervening darkness were hills and winding rivers and weary wastes of plain and desert, and even then the tremendous vista stretched on and on and on to the fires and far beyond. You could not compass it. It was the idea of eternity made tangible, and the longest end of it made visible to the naked eye. The greater part of the vast floor of the desert under us was as black as ink, and apparently smooth and level, but over a mile square of it was ringed and streaked and striped with 1,000 branching streams of liquid and gorgeously brilliant fire. It looked like a colossal railroad map of the state of Massachusetts done in a chain lightning on a midnight sky. Imagine it. Imagine a coal-black sky shivered into a tangled network of angry fire. Here and there were gleaming holes 100 feet in diameter, broken in the dark crust, and in them the melted lava, the color of a dazzling white just tinged with yellow, was boiling and surging furiously, and from these holes branched numberless bright torrents in many directions, like the spokes of a wheel, and kept a tolerably straight course for a while, and then swept round in huge rainbow curves, or made a long succession of sharp worm-fence angles, which looked precisely like the fiercest jagged lightning. These streams met other streams, and they mingled with and crossed and recrossed each other in every conceivable direction, like skate tracks on a popular skating ground. Sometimes streams 20 or 30 feet wide flowed from the holes to some distance without dividing, and through the opera glasses we could see that they ran down small, steep hills, and were genuine cataracts of fire, white at their source, but soon cooling and turning to the richest red, grained with alternate lines of black and gold. Every now and then masses of the dark crust broke away and floated slowly down these streams like rafts down a river. Occasionally the molten lava flowing under the superincumbent crust broke through, split a dazzling streak from 500 to 1,000 feet long like a sudden flash of lightning, and then acre after acre of the cold lava parted into fragments, turned up edgewise like cakes of ice when a great river breaks up, plunged downward, and were swallowed in the crimson cauldron. Then the wide expanse of the thaw maintained a ruddy glow for a while, but shortly cooled and became black and level again. During a thaw, every dismembered cake was marked by a glittering white border which was superbly shaded inward by aurora borealis rays, which were a flaming yellow where they joined the white border, and from thence toward their points tapered into glowing crimson, then into a rich pale carmine, and finally into a faint blush that held its own a moment, and then dimmed and turned black. Some of the streams preferred to mingle together in a tangle of fantastic circles, and then they looked something like the confusion of ropes one sees on a ship's deck when she has just taken in sail and dropped anchor, provided one can imagine those ropes on fire. Through the glasses, the little fountains scattered about looked very beautiful. They boiled and coughed and spluttered and discharged sprays of stringy red fire, of about the consistency of mush, for instance, from 10 to 15 feet into the air, along with a shower of brilliant white sparks, a quaint and unnatural mingling of gouts of blood and snowflakes. We had circles and serpents and streaks of lightning all twined and wreathed and tied together, without a break throughout an area more than a mile square. That amount of ground was covered, though it was not strictly square, and it was with a feeling of placid exultation that we reflected that many years had elapsed since any visitor had seen such a splendid display, since any visitor had seen anything more than the now snubbed and insignificant North and South Lakes in action. We had been reading old files of Hawaiian newspapers and the Record Book at the Volcano House, and were posted. I could see the North Lake lying out on the black floor away off in the outer edge of our panorama, and knitted to it by a webwork of lava streams. In its individual capacity it looked very little more respectable than a schoolhouse on fire. True, it was about 900 feet long and 200 or 300 wide, but then, under the present circumstances, it necessarily appeared rather insignificant, and besides, it was so distant from us. I forgot to say that the noise made by the bubbling lava is not great, heard as we heard it from our lofty perch. It makes 3 distinct sounds, a rushing, a hissing, and a coughing or puffing sound, and if you stand on the brink and close your eyes, it is no trick at all to imagine that you are sweeping down a river on a large low-pressure steamer, and that you hear the hissing of the steam about her boilers, the puffing from her escape pipes, and the churning rush of the water abaft her wheels. The smell of sulphur is strong, but not unpleasant to a sinner. We left the lookout house at 10 o'clock in a half-cooked condition because of the heat from Pele's furnaces, and wrapping up in blankets, for the night was cold, we returned to our hotel. End of Chapter 74. This is Chapter 75 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 75. The next night was appointed for a visit to the bottom of the crater, for we desired to traverse its floor and see the North Lake of fire, which lay 2 miles away, toward the further wall. After dark, half a dozen of us set out, with lanterns and native guides, and climbed down a crazy 1,000-foot pathway in a crevice fractured in the crater wall, and reached the bottom in safety. The eruption of the previous evening had spent its force, and the floor looked black and cold, but when we ran out upon it we found it hot yet to the feet, and it was likewise riven with crevices, which revealed the underlying fires gleaming vindictively. A neighboring cauldron was threatening to overflow, and this added to the dubiousness of the situation. So the native guides refused to continue the venture, and then everybody deserted except a stranger named Marlette. He said he had been in the crater a dozen times in daylight, and believed he could find his way through it at night. He thought that a run of 300 yards would carry us over the hottest part of the floor, and leave us our shoe soles. His pluck gave me backbone. We took one lantern, and instructed the guide to hang the other to the roof of the lookout house to serve as a beacon for us in case we got lost. And then the party started back up the precipice, and Marlette and I made our run. We skipped over the hot floor and over the red crevices with brisk dispatch, and reached the cold lava safe, but with pretty warm feet. Then we took things leisurely and comfortably, jumping tolerably wide and probably bottomless chasms, and threading our way through picturesque lava upheavals with considerable confidence. We got fairly away from the cauldrons of boiling fire. We seemed to be in a gloomy desert, and a suffocatingly dark one, surrounded by dim walls that seemed to tower to the sky. The only cheerful objects were the glinting stars high overhead. By and by Marlette shouted, "Stop!" I never stopped quicker in my life. I asked what the matter was. He said we were out of the path. He said we must not try to go on till we found it again, for we were surrounded with beds of rotten lava through which we could easily break and plunge down 1,000 feet. I thought 800 would answer for me, and was about to say so when Marlette partly proved his statement by accidentally crushing through and disappearing to his armpits. He got out, and we hunted for the path with the lantern. He said there was only one path, and that it was but vaguely defined. We could not find it. The lava surface was all alike in the lantern light, but he was an ingenious man. He said it was not the lantern that had informed him that we were out of the path, but his feet. He had noticed a crisp grinding of the fine lava needles under his feet, and some instinct reminded him that in the path these were all worn away. So he put the lantern behind him, and began to search with his boots instead of his eyes. It was good sagacity. The first time his foot touched the surface that did not grind under it, he announced that the trail was found again, and after that we kept up a sharp listening for the rasping sound, and it always warned us in time. It was a long tramp, but an exciting one. We reached the North Lake between 10 and 11 o'clock, and sat down on a huge overhanging lava shelf, tired but satisfied. The spectacle presented was worth coming double the distance to see. Under us, and stretching away before us, was a heaving sea of molten fire of seemingly limitless extent. The glare from it was so blinding that it was some time before we could bear to look upon it steadily. It was like gazing at the sun at noonday, except that the glare was not quite so white. At unequal distances all around the shores of the lake were nearly white-hot chimneys, or hollow drums of lava 4 or 5 feet high, and up through them were bursting gorgeous sprays of lava gouts and gem spangles, some white, some red, and some golden, a ceaseless bombardment, and one that fascinated the eye with its unapproachable splendor. The mere distant jets, sparkling up through an intervening gossamer veil of vapor, seemed miles away, and the further the curving ranks of fiery fountains receded, the more fairy-like and beautiful they appeared. Now and then the surging bosom of the lake, under our noses, would calm down ominously, and seem to be gathering strength for an enterprise. And then, all of a sudden, a red dome of lava of the bulk of an ordinary dwelling would heave itself aloft like an escaping balloon, then burst asunder, and out of its heart would flit a pale green film of vapor, and float upward and vanish in the darkness. a released soul soaring homeward from captivity with the damned, no doubt. The crashing plunge of the ruined dome into the lake again would send a world of seething billows lashing against the shores and shaking the foundations of our perch. By and by, a loosened mass of the hanging shelf we sat on tumbled into the lake, jarring the surroundings like an earthquake, and delivering a suggestion that may have been intended for a hint, and may not. We did not wait to see. We got lost again on our way back, and were more than an hour hunting for the path. We were where we could see the beacon lantern at the lookout house at the time, but thought it was a star and paid no attention to it. We reached the hotel at 2 o'clock in the morning pretty well fagged out. Kilauea never overflows its vast crater, but bursts a passage for its lava through the mountainside when relief is necessary, and then the destruction is fearful. About 1840 it rent its overburdened stomach and sent a broad river of fire careening down to the sea, which swept away forests, huts, plantations, and everything else that lay in its path. The stream was 5 miles broad in places and 200 feet deep, and the distance it traveled was 40 miles. It tore up and bore away acre patches of land on its bosom like rafts, rocks, trees, and all intact. At night the red glare was visible 100 miles at sea, and at a distance of 40 miles fine print could be read at midnight. The atmosphere was poisoned with sulphurous vapors and choked with falling ashes, pumice stones, and cinders. Countless columns of smoke rose up and blended together in a tumbled canopy that hid the heavens and glowed with a ruddy flush reflected from the fires below. Here and there jets of lava sprung hundreds of feet into the air and burst into rocket sprays that returned to earth in a crimson rain. And all the while the laboring mountain shook with nature's great palsy and voiced its distress in moanings and the muffled booming of subterranean thunders. Fishes were killed for 20 miles along the shore where the lava entered the sea. The earthquakes caused some loss of human life, and a prodigious tidal wave swept inland, carrying everything before it and drowning a number of natives. The devastation consummated along the route traversed by the river of lava was complete and incalculable. Only a Pompeii and a Herculaneum were needed at the foot of Kilauea to make the story of the eruption immortal. End of chapter 75. This is Chapter 76 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 76. We rode horseback all around the island of Hawaii, the crooked road making the distance 200 miles, and enjoyed the journey very much. We were more than a week making the trip, because our Kanaka horses would not go by a house or a hut without stopping. Whip and spur could not alter their minds about it, and so we finally found that it economized time to let them have their way. Upon inquiry, the mystery was explained. The natives are such thoroughgoing gossips that they never pass a house without stopping to swap news, and consequently their horses learn to regard that sort of thing as an essential part of the whole duty of man and his salvation, not to be compassed without it. However, at a former crisis of my life I had once taken an aristocratic young lady out driving, behind a horse that had just retired from a long and honorable career as the moving impulse of a milk wagon, and so this present experience awoke a reminiscent sadness in me in place of the exasperation more natural to the occasion. I remembered how helpless I was that day, and how humiliated, how ashamed I was of having intimated to the girl that I had always owned the horse and was accustomed to grandeur, how hard I tried to appear easy and even vivacious under suffering that was consuming my vitals, how placidly and maliciously the girl smiled, and kept on smiling, while my hot blushes baked themselves into a permanent blood pudding in my face, how the horse ambled from one side of the street to the other and waited complacently before every third house 2 minutes and a quarter, while I belabored his back and reviled him in my heart, how I tried to keep him from turning corners and failed, how I moved heaven and earth to get him out of town, and did not succeed. How he traversed the entire settlement and delivered imaginary milk at 162 different domiciles, and how he finally brought up at a dairy depot and refused to budge further, thus rounding and completing the revealment of what the plebeian service of his life had been. How in eloquent silence I walked the girl home, and how, when I took leave of her, her parting remarks scorched my soul, and appeared to blister me all over. She said that my horse was a fine, capable animal, and I must have taken great comfort in him in my time, but that if I would take along some milk tickets next time and appear to deliver them at the various halting places, it might expedite his movements a little. There was a coolness between us after that. In one place in the island of Hawaii, we saw a laced and ruffled cataract of limpid water leaping from a sheer precipice 1,500 feet high, but that sort of scenery finds its staunchest ally in the arithmetic rather than in spectacular effect. If one desires to be so stirred by a poem of nature wrought in the happily commingled graces of picturesque rocks, glimpsed distances, foliage, color, shifting lights and shadows, and falling water, that the tears almost come into his eyes, so potent is the charm exerted, he need not go away from America to enjoy such an experience. The Rainbow Fall in Watkins Glen, New York, on the Erie Railway, is an example. It would recede into pitiable insignificance if the callous tourist drew on arithmetic on it, but left to compete for the honors simply on scenic grace and beauty, the grand, the august, and the sublime being barred the contest, it could challenge the old world and the new to produce its peer. In one locality on our journey we saw some horses that had been born and reared on top of the mountains, above the range of running water, and consequently they had never drank that fluid in their lives, but had been always accustomed to quenching their thirst by eating dew-laden or shower-wetted leaves, and now it was destructively funny to see them sniff suspiciously at a pail of water, and then put in their noses and try to take a bite out of the fluid, as if it were a solid. Finding it liquid, they would snatch away their heads and fall to trembling, snorting, and showing other evidences of fright. When they became convinced at last that the water was friendly and harmless, they thrust their noses up to their eyes, brought out a mouthful of water, and proceeded to chew it complacently. We saw a man coax, kick, and spur one of them 5 or 10 minutes before he could make it cross a running stream. It spread its nostrils, distended its eyes, and trembled all over, just as horses customarily do in the presence of a serpent, and for aught I know it thought the crawling stream was a serpent. In due course of time our journey came to an end at Kauai, usually pronounced Tuahai, and before we find fault with this elaborate orthographical method of arriving at such an unostentatious result, let us lop off the ugh from our word though. I made this horseback trip on a mule. I paid $10 for him at Kau, added 4 to get him shod, rode him 200 miles, and then sold him for $15. I marked the circumstance with a white stone in the absence of chalk, for I never saw a white stone that a body could mark anything with, though out of respect for the ancients I have tried it often enough. For up to that day and date it was the first strictly commercial transaction I had ever entered into, and come out winner. We returned to Honolulu, and from thence sailed to the island of Maui, and spent several weeks there very pleasantly. I still remember, with a sense of indolent luxury, a picnicking excursion up a romantic gorge there called the Iao Valley. The trail lay along the edge of a brawling stream in the bottom of the gorge, a shady route, for it was well roofed with the verdant domes of forest trees. Through openings in the foliage we glimpsed picturesque scenery that revealed ceaseless changes and new charms with every step of our progress. Perpendicular walls from 1 to 3,000 feet high guarded the way, and were sumptuously plumed with varied foliage in places, and in places swathed in waving ferns. Passing shreds of cloud trailed their shadows across these shining fronts, mottling them with blots. Billowy masses of white vapor hid the turreted summits, and far above the vapor swelled a background of gleaming green crags and cones that came and went through the veiling mists, like islands drifting in a fog. Sometimes the cloudy curtain descended till half the cannon wall was hidden, then shredded gradually away till only airy glimpses of the ferny front appeared through it, then swept aloft and left it glorified in the sun again. Now and then, as our position changed, rocky bastions swung out from the wall, a mimic ruin of castellated ramparts and crumbling towers clothed with mosses and hung with garlands of swaying vines, and as we moved on they swung back again and hid themselves once more in the foliage. Presently a verdure-clad needle of stone, 1,000 feet high, stepped out from behind a corner and mounted guard over the mysteries of the valley. It seemed to me that if Captain Cook needed a monument, here was one ready-made. Therefore, why not put up his sign here and sell out the venerable coconut stump? But the chief pride of Maui is her dead volcano of Haleakala, which means, translated, the House of the Sun. We climbed 1,000 feet up the side of this isolated colossus one afternoon, then camped, and next day climbed the remaining 9,000 feet, and anchored on the summit, where we built a fire and froze and roasted by turns all night. With the first pallor of dawn we got up and saw things that were new to us. Mounted on a commanding pinnacle, we watched nature work her silent wonders. The sea was spread abroad on every hand, its tumbled surface seeming only wrinkled and dimpled in the distance. A broad valley below appeared like an ample checkerboard, its velvety green sugar plantations alternating with dun squares of barrenness and groves of trees diminished to mossy tufts. Beyond the valley were mountains picturesquely grouped together, but bear in mind we fancied that we were looking up at these things, not down. We seemed to sit in the bottom of a symmetrical bowl 10,000 feet deep, with the valley and the skirting sea lifted away into the sky above us. It was curious, and not only curious but aggravating, for it was having our trouble all for nothing to climb 10,000 feet toward heaven and then have to look up at our scenery. However, we had to be content with it and make the best of it. For all we could do, we could not coax our landscape down out of the clouds. Formerly, when I had read an article in which Poe treated of this singular fraud perpetrated upon the eye by isolated great altitudes, I had looked upon the matter as an invention of his own fancy. I have spoken of the outside view, but we had an inside one, too. That was the yawning dead crater into which we now and then tumbled rocks, half as large as a barrel, from our perch, and saw them go careening down the almost perpendicular sides, bounding 300 feet at a jump, kicking up cast clouds wherever they struck, diminishing to our view as they sped farther into distance, growing invisible finally, and only betraying their course by faint little puffs of dust, and coming to a halt at last in the bottom of the abyss, 2,500 feet down from where they started. It was magnificent sport. We wore ourselves out at it. The Crater of Vesuvius, as I have before remarked, is a modest pit about 1,000 feet deep and 3,000 in circumference. That of Kilauea is somewhat deeper and 10 miles in circumference. But what are either of them compared to the vacant stomach of Haleakala? I will not offer any figures of my own, but give official ones, those of Commander Wilkes, U.S. Navy, who surveyed it and testifies that it is 27 miles in circumference. If it had a level bottom, it would make a fine site for a city like London. It must have afforded a spectacle worth contemplating in the old days, when its furnaces gave full rein to their anger. Presently, vagrant white clouds came drifting along high over the sea and the valley. Then they came in couples and groups. Then in imposing squadrons. Gradually joining their forces, they banked themselves solidly together 1,000 feet under us, and totally shut out land and ocean. Not a vestige of anything was left in view, but just a little of the rim of the crater, circling away from the pinnacle whereon we sat, for a ghostly procession of wanderers from the filmy hosts without had drifted through a chasm in the crater wall, and filed round and round, and gathered and sunk and blended together till the abyss was stored to the brim with a fleecy fog. Thus banked, motion ceased, and silence reigned. Clear to the horizon, league on league, the snowy floor stretched without a break, not level, but in rounded folds, with shallow creases between, and with here and there stately piles of vapory architecture lifting themselves aloft out of the common plain, some near at hand, some in the middle distances, and others relieving the monotony of the remote solitudes. There was little conversation, for the impressive scene overawed speech. I felt like the last man, neglected of the judgment, and left pinnacled in mid-heaven, a forgotten relic of a vanished world. While the hush yet brooded, the messengers of the coming resurrection appeared in the east. A growing warmth suffused the horizon, and soon the sun emerged and looked out over the cloud-waste, flinging bars of ruddy light across it, staining its folds and billow-caps with blushes, purpling the shaded troughs between, and glorifying the massy vapor-palaces and cathedrals with a wasteful splendor of all blendings and combinations of rich coloring. It was the sublimest spectacle I ever witnessed, and I think the memory of it will remain with me always. End of chapter 76. Chapter 77 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain. Chapter 77. I stumbled upon one curious character in the island of Mani. He became a sore annoyance to me in the course of time. My first glimpse of him was in a sort of public room in the town of Lahaina. He occupied a chair at the opposite side of the apartment, and sat eyeing our party with interest for some minutes, and listening as critically to what we were saying as if he fancied we were talking to him and expecting him to reply. I thought it very sociable in a stranger. Presently, in the course of conversation, I made a statement bearing upon the subject under discussion, and I made it with due modesty, for there was nothing extraordinary about it, and it was only put forth in illustration of a point at issue. I had barely finished when this person spoke out with rapid utterance and feverish anxiety. "Oh, that was certainly remarkable, after a fashion, but you ought to have seen my chimney. You ought to have seen my chimney, sir. Smoke? I wish I may hang if— Mr. Jones, you remember that chimney? You must remember that chimney. No, I recollect now. You weren't living on this side of the island then. But I am telling you nothing but the truth, and I wish I may never draw another breath if that chimney didn't smoke so that the smoke actually got caked in it, and I had to dig it out with a pickaxe. You may smile, gentlemen, but the high sheriff's got a hunk of it which I dug out before his eyes, and so it's perfectly easy for you to go and examine for yourselves." The interruption broke up the conversation, which had already begun to lag, and we presently hired some natives and an outrigger canoe or two, and went out to overlook a grand surf-bathing contest. 2 weeks after this, while talking in a company, I looked up and detected this same man boring through and through me with his intense eye, and noted again his twitching muscles and his feverish anxiety to speak. The moment I paused, he said, "Beg your pardon, sir, beg your pardon, but it can only be considered remarkable when brought into strong outline by isolation. Sir, contrasted with a circumstance which occurred in my own experience, it instantly becomes commonplace. No, not that, for I will not speak so discourteously of any experience in the career of a stranger and a gentleman, but I am obliged to say that you could not, and you would not ever again refer to this tree as a large one if you could behold, as I have, the great Yakmatak tree in the island Wanaska, Sea of Kamchatka, a tree, sir, not 1 inch less than 415 feet in solid diameter. And I wish I may die in a minute if it isn't so. Oh, you needn't look so questioning, gentlemen. Here's old Captain Saltmarsh can say whether I know what I am talking about or not. I showed him the tree." Captain Saltmarsh: "Come now, cat your anchor, lad. You're heaving too taut. You promised to show me that stunner, and I walked more than 11 mile with you through the cussedest jungle I ever see, a hunting for it. But the tree you showed me finally warn't as big round as a beer cask, and you know that your own self, Marcus." Hear the man talk! Of course the tree was reduced that way, but didn't I explain it? Answer me, didn't I? Didn't I say I wished you could have seen it when I first saw it? When you got up on your ear and called me names and said I had brought you 11 miles to look at a sapling, didn't I explain to you that all the whale ships in North Seas had been wooding off of it for more than 27 years? And didn't you suppose the tree could last forever, confound it? I don't see why you want to keep back things that way, and try to injure a person that's never done you any harm." Somehow this man's presence made me uncomfortable, and I was glad when a native arrived at that moment to say that Makawao, the most companionable and luxurious among the rude war chiefs of the islands, desired us to come over and help him enjoy a missionary whom he had found trespassing on his grounds. I think it was about 10 days afterward that, as I finished a statement I was making for the instruction of a group of friends and acquaintances, and which made no pretense of being extraordinary, a familiar voice chimed instantly in on the heels of my last word, and said, "But, my dear sir, there was nothing remarkable about that horse, or the circumstance either. Nothing in the world. I mean no sort of offense when I say it, sir, but you really do not know anything whatever about speed. Bless your heart, if you could only have seen my mare Margaretta, there was a beast. There was lightning for you. Trot. Trot is no name for it. She flew. How she could whirl a buggy along. I started her out, sir. Colonel Bilgewater, you recollect that animal perfectly well. I started her out about 30 or 35 yards ahead of the awfulest storm I ever saw in my life, and it chased us upwards of 18 miles. It did, by the everlasting hills. And I'm telling you nothing but the unvarnished truth when I say that not one single drop of rain fell on me. Not a single drop, sir, and I swear to it. But my dog was a-swimming behind the wagon all the way. For a week or two I stayed mostly within doors, for I seemed to meet this person everywhere, and he had become utterly hateful to me. But one evening I dropped in on Captain Perkins and his friends, and we had a sociable time. About 10 o'clock I chanced to be talking about a merchant friend of mine, and without really intending it, the remark slipped out that he was a little mean and parsimonious about paying his workmen. Instantly, through the steam of a hot whiskey punch on the opposite side of the room, a remembered voice shot, and for a moment I trembled on the imminent verge of profanity. "Oh, my dear sir, really you expose yourself when you parade that as a surprising circumstance. Bless your heart and hide, you are ignorant of the very ABC of meanness. Ignorant as the unborn babe. Ignorant as unborn twins. You don't know anything about it. It is pitiable to see you, sir, a well-spoken and prepossessing stranger, making such an enormous powwow here about a subject concerning which your ignorance is perfectly humiliating. Look me in the eye, if you please. Look me in the eye. John James Godfrey was the son of poor but honest parents in the state of Mississippi, boyhood friend of mine, bosom comrade in later years. Heaven rest his noble spirit, he is gone from us now. John James Godfrey was hired by the Hay Blossom Mining Company of California to do some blasting for them, the Incorporated Company of Mean Men, the boys used to call it. Well, one day he drilled a hole about 4 feet deep and put in an awful blast of powder, and was standing over it ramming it down with an iron crowbar about 9 feet long, when the cussed thing struck a spark and fired the powder, and scat! Away John Godfrey whizzed like a skyrocket, him and his crowbar. Well, sir, he kept on going up in the air higher and higher till he didn't look any bigger than a boy, and he kept going on up higher and higher till he didn't look any bigger than a doll. And he kept on going up higher and higher till he didn't look any bigger than a little small bee, and then he went out of sight. Presently he came in sight again, looking like a little small bee, and he came along down further and further till he looked as big as a doll again, and down further and further till he was as big as a boy again, and further and further till he was a full-sized man once more, and then him and his crowbar came a-whizzing down and lit right exactly in the same old tracks, and went to ramming down and ramming down and ramming down again, just the same as if nothing had happened. Now, do you know, that poor cuss warn't gone only 16 minutes, and yet that Incorporated Company of Mean Men docked him for the lost time." I said I had the headache, and so excused myself and went home. And on my diary I entered, Another night spoiled by this offensive loafer, and a fervent curse was set down with it to keep the item company. And the very next day I packed up, out of all patience, and left the island. Almost from the very beginning I regarded that man as a liar. The line of points represents an interval of years, at the end of which time the opinion hazarded in that last sentence came to be gratifyingly and remarkably endorsed, and by wholly disinterested persons. The man, Marcus, was found one morning hanging to a beam of his own bedroom, the doors and windows securely fastened on the inside, dead, and on his breast was pinned a paper in his own handwriting begging his friends to suspect no innocent person of having anything to do with his death, for that it was the work of his own hands entirely. Yet the jury brought in the astounding verdict that deceased came to his death by the hands of some person or persons unknown. They explained that the perfectly undeviating consistency of Marcus's character for 30 years towered aloft as colossal and indestructible testimony that whatever statement he chose to make was entitled to instant and unquestioning acceptance as a lie, and they furthermore stated their belief that he was not dead, and instanced the strong circumstantial evidence of his own word that he was dead, and beseeched the coroner to delay the funeral as long as possible, which was done. And so, in the tropical climate of Lahaina, the coffin stood open for 7 days, and then even the loyal jury gave him up. But they sat on him again, and changed their verdict to suicide induced by mental aberration, because, they said, with penetration, he said he was dead, and he was dead, and would he have told the truth if he had been in his right mind? No, sir. End of chapter 77. This is chapter 78 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, chapter 78. After half a year's luxurious vagrancy in the islands, I took shipping in a sailing vessel and regretfully returned to San Francisco. A voyage in every way delightful, but without an incident, unless lying 2 long weeks in a dead calm 1,800 miles from the nearest land may rank as an incident. Schools of whales grew so tame that day after day they played about the ship among the porpoises and the sharks without the least apparent fear of us, and we pelted them with empty bottles for lack of better sport. 24 hours afterward these bottles would be still lying on the glassy water under our noses, showing that the ship had not moved out of her place in all that time. The calm was absolutely breathless, and the surface of the sea absolutely without a wrinkle. For a whole day and part of a night we lay so close to another ship that had drifted to our vicinity that we carried on conversations with her passengers, introduced each other by name, and became pretty intimately acquainted with people we had never heard of before and have never heard of since. This was the only vessel we saw during the whole lonely voyage. We had 15 passengers, and to show how hard-pressed they were at last for occupation and amusement, I will mention that the gentlemen gave a good part of their time every day during the calm to trying to sit on an empty champagne bottle lying on its side, and thread a needle without touching their heels to the deck or falling over, and the ladies sat in the shade of the mainsail and watched the enterprise with absorbing interest. We were at sea 5 Sundays, and yet, but for the almanac, we never would have known but that all the other days were Sundays too. I was home again in San Francisco without means and without employment. I tortured my brain for a saving scheme of some kind, and at last a public lecture occurred to me. I sat down and wrote one in a fever of hopeful anticipation. I showed it to several friends, but they all shook their heads. They said nobody would come to hear me. I would make a humiliating failure of it. They said that as I had never spoken in public, I would break down in the delivery anyhow. I was disconsolate now. But at last an editor slapped me on the back and told me to go ahead. He said, "Take the largest house in town and charge $1 a ticket." The audacity of the proposition was charming. It seemed fraught with practical worldly wisdom, however. The proprietor of the several theaters endorsed the advice, and said I might have his handsome new opera house at half price, $50. In sheer desperation I took it, on credit, for sufficient reasons. In 3 days I did $150 worth of printing and advertising, and was the most distressed and frightened creature on the Pacific coast. I could not sleep. Who could under such circumstances? For other people there was facetiousness in the last line of my posters, but to me it was plaintive with a pang when I wrote it. Doors open at 7:30. The trouble will begin at 8. That line has done good service since. Showmen have borrowed it frequently. I have even seen it appended to a newspaper advertisement reminding school pupils in vacation what time next term would begin. As those 3 days of suspense dragged by, I grew more and more unhappy. I had sold 200 tickets among my personal friends, but I feared they might not come. My lecture, which had seemed humorous to me at first, grew steadily more and more dreary, till not a vestige of fun seemed left, and I grieved that I could not bring a coffin on the stage and turn the thing into a funeral. I was so panic-stricken at last that I went to 3 old friends, giants in stature, cordial by nature, and stormy-voiced, and said, "This thing is going to be a failure. The jokes in it are so dim that nobody will ever see them. I would like to have you sit in the parquet and help me through." Well, they said they would. Then I went to the wife of a popular citizen and said that if she was willing to do me a very great kindness I would be glad if she and her husband would sit prominently in the left-hand stage box where the whole house could see them. I explained that I should need help, and would turn toward her and smile as a signal when I had been delivered of an obscure joke. And then, I added, don't wait to investigate, but respond. She promised. Down the street I met a man I never had seen before. He had been drinking, and was beaming with smiles and good nature. He said, "My name's Sawyer. You don't know me, but that don't matter. I haven't got a cent, but if you knew how bad I wanted to laugh, you'd give me a ticket. Come now, what do you say?" "Is your laugh hung on a hair-trigger? That is it critical, or can you get it off easy?" My drawling infirmity of speech so affected him that he laughed a specimen or two that struck me as being about the article I wanted, and I gave him a ticket, and appointed him to sit in the second circle in the center, and be responsible for that division of the house. I gave him minute instructions about how to detect indistinct jokes, and then went away and left him chuckling placidly over the novelty of the idea. I ate nothing on the last of the 3 eventful days. I only suffered. I had advertised that on this 3rd day the box office would be opened for the sale of reserved seats. I crept down to the theater at 4 in the afternoon to see if any sales had been made. The ticket seller was gone. The box office was locked up. I had to swallow suddenly, or my heart would have got out. No sales, I said to myself. I might have known it. I thought of suicide, pretended illness, flight. I thought of these things in earnest, for I was very miserable and scared. But of course I had to drive them away, and prepare to meet my fate. I could not wait for 7:30. I wanted to face the horror, and end it. The feeling of many a man doomed to hang, no doubt. I went down back streets at 6 o'clock, and entered the theater by the back door. I stumbled my way in the dark among the ranks of canvas scenery, and stood on the stage. The house was gloomy and silent, and its emptiness depressing. I went into the dark among the scenes again, and for an hour and a half gave myself up to the horrors, wholly unconscious of everything else. Then I heard a murmur. It rose higher and higher, and ended in a crash, mingled with cheers. It made my hair raise, it was so close to me, and so loud. There was a pause, and then another. Presently came a third, and before I well knew what I was about, I was in the middle of the stage, staring at a sea of faces, bewildered by the fierce glare of the lights, and quaking in every limb with a terror that seemed like to take my life away. The house was full, aisles and all. The tumult in my heart and brain and legs continued a full minute before I could gain any command over myself. Then I recognized the charity and the friendliness in the faces before me, and little by little my fright melted away, and I began to talk. Within 3 or 4 minutes I was comfortable, and even content. My 3 chief allies, with 3 auxiliaries, were on hand in the parquet, all sitting together, all armed with bludgeons, and all ready to make an onslaught upon the feeblest joke that might show its head. And whenever a joke did fall, their bludgeons came down, and their faces seemed to split from ear to ear. Sawyer, whose hearty countenance was seen looming redly in the center of the second circle, took it up, and the house was carried handsomely. Inferior jokes never fared so royally before. Presently I delivered a bit of serious matter with impressive unction. It was my pet, and the audience listened with an absorbed hush that gratified me more than any applause. And as I dropped the last word of the clause, I happened to turn and catch Mrs. her intent and waiting eye. My conversation with her flashed upon me, and in spite of all I could do, I smiled. She took it for the signal, and promptly delivered a mellow laugh that touched off the whole audience, and the explosion that followed was the triumph of the evening. I thought that honest man Sawyer would choke himself, and as for the bludgeons, they performed like pile-drivers. But my poor little morsel of pathos was ruined. It was taken in good faith as an intentional joke, and the prize one of the entertainment, and I wisely let it go at that. All the papers were kind in the morning. My appetite returned. I had an abundance of money. All's well that ends well. End of chapter 78. This is chapter 79 of Roughing It. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Roughing It by Mark Twain, Chapter 79. I launched out as a lecturer now with great boldness. I had the field all to myself, for public lectures were almost an unknown commodity in the Pacific market. They are not so rare now, I suppose. I took an old personal friend along to play agent for me, and for 2 or 3 weeks we roamed through Nevada and California and had a very cheerful time of it. 2 days before I lectured in Virginia City, 2 stage-coaches were robbed within 2 miles of the town. The daring act was committed just at dawn by 6 masked men who sprang up alongside the coaches, presented revolvers at the heads of the drivers and passengers, and commanded a general dismount. Everybody climbed down, and the robbers took their watches and every cent they had. Then they took gunpowder and blew up the express specie boxes and got their contents. The leader of the robbers was a small, quick-spoken man, and the fame of his vigorous manner and his intrepidity was in everybody's mouth when we arrived. The night after instructing Virginia, I walked over the desolate divide and down to Gold Hill and lectured there. The lecture done, I stopped to talk with a friend and did not start back till 11. The divide was high, unoccupied ground between the towns, the scene of 20 midnight murders and 100 robberies. As we climbed up and stepped out on this eminence, the Gold Hill lights dropped out of sight at our backs, and the night closed down gloomy and dismal. A sharp wind swept the place, too, and chilled our perspiring bodies through. "I tell you I don't like this place at night," said Mike, the agent. "Well, don't speak so loud," I said. "You needn't remind anybody that we are here." Just then a dim figure approached me from the direction of Virginia, a man, evidently. He came straight at me, and I stepped aside to let him pass. He stepped in the way and confronted me again. Then I saw that he had a mask on and was holding something in my face. I heard a click, click, and recognized a revolver in the dim outline. I pushed the barrel aside with my hand and said, "Don't." He ejaculated sharply, "Your watch! Your money!" I said, "You can have them with pleasure, but take the pistol away from my face, please. It makes me shiver." No remarks. Hand out your money. Certainly. I put up your hands. Don't you go for a weapon. Put 'em up higher. I held them above my head. A pause. Then, are you going to hand out your money or not? I dropped my hands to my pockets and said, Certainly. I put up your hands. Do you want your head blown off? Higher. I put them above my head again. Another pause. Are you going to hand out your money or not? Again? Put up your hands. By George, you want the head shot off you awful bad. Well, friend, I'm trying my best to please you. You tell me to give up my money, and when I reach for it, you tell me to put up my hands. If you would only— Oh, now don't, all 6 of you at me. That other man will get away while— Now, please, take some of those revolvers out of my face. Do, if you please. Every time one of them clicks, my liver comes up into my throat. If you have a mother, any of you, or if any of you have ever had a mother, or a grandmother, or a— Cheese it! Will you give up your money, or have we got to— There, none of that. Put up your hands. Gentlemen, I know you are gentlemen by your— Silence! If you want to be facetious, young man, there are times and places more fitting. This is serious business. You prick the marrow of my opinion. The funerals I have attended in my time were comedies compared to it. Now, I think— Curse your palaver! Your money! Your money! Your money! Hold! Put up your hands! Gentlemen, listen to reason. You see how I am situated. Now, don't put those pistols so close. I smell the powder. You see how I am situated. If I had 4 hands, so that I could hold up 2 and— Throttle him! Gag him! Kill him! Gentlemen, don't. Nobody's watching the other fellow. Why don't some of you— Ouch! Take it away, please. Gentlemen, you see that I've got to hold up my hands, and so I can't take out my money. But if you'll be so kind as to take it out for me, I will do as much for you some— Search him, Beauregard, and stop his jaw with a bullet quick if he wags it again. Help, Beauregard! Stonewall! Then 3 of them, with a small, spry leader, adjourned to Mike and fell to searching him. I was so excited that my lawless fancy tortured me to ask my 2 men all manner of facetious questions about their rebel brother generals of the South, but, considering the order they had received, it was but common prudence to keep still. When everything had been taken from me, watch, money, and a multitude of trifles of small value, I supposed I was free, and forthwith put my cold hands into my empty pockets and began an inoffensive jig to warm my feet and stir up some latent courage. But instantly all pistols were at my head, and the order came again. They stood Mike up alongside of me, with strict orders to keep his hands above his head, too, and then the chief highwayman said, Beauregard, hide behind that boulder. Phil Sheridan, you hide behind that other one. Stonewall Jackson, put yourself behind that sage bush there. Keep your pistols bearing on these fellows, and if they take down their hands within 10 minutes or move a single peg, let 'em have it. Then 3 disappeared in the gloom toward the several ambushes, and the other 3 disappeared down the road toward Virginia. It was depressingly still and miserably cold. Now this whole thing was a practical joke, and the robbers were personal friends of ours in disguise, and 20 more lay hidden within 10 feet of us during the whole operation listening. Mike knew all of this, and was in the joke, but I suspected nothing of it. To me it was most uncomfortably genuine. When we had stood there in the middle of the road 5 minutes, like a couple of idiots, with our hands aloft, freezing to death by inches, Mike's interest in the joke began to wane. He said, The time's up now, ain't it? No, you keep still. Do you want to take any chances with these bloody savages? Presently Mike said, Now the time's up anyway. I'm freezing. Well, freeze. Better freeze than carry your brains home in a basket. Maybe the time is up, but how do we know? Got no watch to tell by. I mean to give them good measure. I calculate to stand here 15 minutes or die. Don't you move. So, without knowing it, I was making one joker very sick of his contract. When we took our arms down at last, they were aching with cold and fatigue, and when we went sneaking off, the dread I was in, that the time might not yet be up, and that we would feel bullets in a moment, was not sufficient to draw all my attention from the misery that racked my stiffened body. The joke of these highwayman friends of ours was mainly a joke upon themselves, for they had waited for me on the cold hilltop 2 full hours before I came, and there was very little fun in that. They were so chilled that it took them a couple of weeks to get warm again. Moreover, I never had a thought that they would kill me to get money which it was so perfectly easy to get without any such folly, and so they did not really frighten me bad enough to make their enjoyment worth the trouble they had taken. I was only afraid that their weapons would go off accidentally. Their very numbers inspired me with confidence that no blood would be intentionally spilled. They were not smart. They ought to have sent only one highwayman with a double-barreled shotgun if they desired to see the author of this volume climb a tree. However, I suppose that in the long run I got the largest share of the joke at last, and in a shape not foreseen by the highwaymen, for the chilly exposure on the divide, while I was in a perspiration, gave me a cold which developed itself into a troublesome disease and kept my hands idle some 3 months, besides costing me quite a sum in doctor's bills. Since then I play no practical jokes on people, and generally lose my temper when one is played upon me. When I returned to San Francisco, I projected a pleasure journey to Japan and thence westward around the world, but a desire to see home again changed my mind, and I took a berth in the steamship, bade good-bye to the friendliest and the livest, heartiest community on our continent, and came by the way of the Isthmus to New York, a trip that was not much of a picnic excursion, for the cholera broke out among us on the passage, and we buried 2 or 3 bodies at sea every day. I found home a dreary place after my long absence, for half the children I had known were now wearing whiskers or waterfalls, and few of the grown people I had been acquainted with remained at their hearthstones prosperous and happy. Some of them had wandered to other scenes. Some were in jail, and the rest had been hanged. These changes touched me deeply, and I went away and joined the famous Quaker City European excursion, and carried my tears to foreign lands. Thus, after 7 years of vicissitudes, ended a pleasure trip to the silver mines of Nevada, which had originally been intended to occupy only 3 months. However, I usually miss my calculations further than that. Moral: if the reader thinks he is done now, and that this book has no moral to it, he is in error. The moral of it is this: if you are of any account, stay at home and make your way by faithful diligence. But if you are no account, go away from home, and then you will have to work, whether you want to or not. Thus you become a blessing to your friends by ceasing to be a nuisance to them, if the people you go among suffer by the operation. The End. End of chapter 79.